Welcome to Hustle and Flow with Heather Hubbard, episode 166. Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard, and I was a litigator, partner, and practice group leader at an AmLaw 200 firm. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your personal life. So how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you embrace your ambition without selling your soul? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. Welcome back. I am your host, Heather Hubbard. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope you had a wonderful Memorial Day weekend and you are ready to get back in the swing of things. I have a really special guest for you guys this week. I've been wanting to have him on for a while, and I know we don't have a lot of guys come on as guests, but today's guest really is someone whom I admire. I think he is just amazing, and I'm so excited to be able to have him on today. So our guest is Likky Lavji, and he was in IT. He had his own company in IT support services for 25 years and sold it, and then became an executive coach, a keynote speaker. And he's someone whom I respect and admire and think he's just brilliant. We have such great conversations. I think we are a lot alike in many different ways. But what he's known for is being the blind spot navigator. So he really does have this knack for helping others identify their blind spots and then move through them. So as I said, he's an executive business coach and keynote speaker. He has worked with a ton of organizations, especially in Canada. He is based in Vancouver. So he's worked with Lenovo, Royal Bank of Canada, the Canadian Cancer Society, the Vancouver Airport Authority, just to name a few. But he also does work and speaks in America. So for our U.S. listeners, you may still be interested in actually having him come in and work with your company. So you've probably heard him potentially on a podcast before. He speaks to leadership, breaking organizational barriers, employee happiness, and like I said, blind spots. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today, as I'm sure we're going to talk about other things as well, because that's how I like to do these interviews. I don't know if you guys know that, but we don't have agendas. We don't have scripts. We don't have outlines, because I like to have genuine conversations where we are just being present in the moment and we see where it goes, because I think those are actually the best conversations. So let's get to the interview. Likky, welcome to Hustle and Flow.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
I'm so glad we're able to do this. You know, we tried this once before. The mics weren't working, so we're trying it again, but we're definitely having you on the show. I have so many questions for you, and I'm hoping we can get them all in. Let's start. I want to start with your background. I want to start with because you owned a business for 25 years, right? I want to hear about that. And then let's talk about your transition. But let's talk about your background.
Well, the background, the IT company started by fluke. Back when I was 19 years old, I was in so much debt that I didn't know how to deal with anything. And I, high school dropout, just having different sales jobs. And then one day I found this little ad about a course on how to build database applications. And I didn't know what that was, but I had to go to school, so I took a night course. And the instructor there and I hit it off really well. It was a course on something called DBase. Now, I'm really dating myself. This is way back in the day. And he and I hit it off so well that he gave me a job at a computer company. And I started selling computers at that point. And I really enjoyed it. And then I enjoyed database applications. So 2 years into this job, I learned a lot. And I started developing inventory systems and accounting systems and implementing accounting systems. I figured, I'll go on my own. So I started my own IT company back then, and that lasted just over 25 years. Ups and downs through the Y2K days, but had a lot of fun doing it.
So there's not a lot of people that would start a company at that young of an age. Have you always considered yourself a risk taker?
Yeah, that's an understatement. I don't think about things. I just do them.
Yep.
And then I pay for it after. And it's okay. It's served me well so far, but I don't overthink things. I just make things happen. If I want something, I'll go find a way of getting it. If I want to do something, I'll just find a way of doing it. Between the 25 years of IT company, I actually had 4 other startups I started and sold off as well within that IT company as well. So.
Oh, I didn't realize that. So were those like subsidiaries within the IT company or totally different?
Okay, now you're the lawyer talking to me. Subsidiaries means I had to put a structure in place. No. I just did stuff. I told you, I just do stuff. I came up with this. I don't know. Maybe you've heard of text to SMS to BlackBerry. You know that old thing way back when. We were one of the first companies in Vancouver to send emails to a BlackBerry pager.
Oh wow!
And I branded a product called M Pager, and I sold it off.
Love it. So you were creating things, you were selling things, you were just doing the thing. So what was your biggest lesson learned from starting and running and selling those companies in the IT world?
I think greed got in the way. Mm-hmm. And when I say that, I was a solopreneur. So I was either myself or 1 or 2 contractors / people always helping me. But in the late 2000s, I ended up hiring people. And the only reason I hired people was, I did so well in business. If I hired more people, I'll do even better. Mm-hmm. So that was the greed that got in the way. And that really failed because remember, I've had no training in leadership at that point. I was just an entrepreneur, just made things happen. When you have people to work with, you can't just run business that way. You can't just pretend you're a leader when you're not. Mm-hmm. And that was my biggest learning point, is that to be a leader and to have employees, you've got to shift the way you do business. And having greed in the way never works.
How many employees did you have at the largest?
In the Y2K days, I had 14 employees at one point. Actually, it went up to 18 at one point as well. And I'll tell you that the biggest thing that we ended up doing in about, I think it was 2014 or 2013, I ended up coming into the office, pulled my vice president into the office. I said, this is not working. The team is not aligned. And we ended up firing everybody and or they quit.
Wow.
And I had to go back to my root values, which is providing customer service, but also taking care of the team and building trust. Mm-hmm. So the 3 of us ended up building the business up again. We were in debt at that point. We were 6 figures in debt. We turned that business around in 6 months, hired 8 key people. When I say key people, these were lined up with our values and our missions. And I did a lot of self-reflection at that point on how to build trust, how to be a leader. And that's when we built the business up. And a year and a half later, we sold it.
That's fascinating because it really does go to, you're calling it greed, but it's really like scaling for the sake of scaling, right? Like that's not necessarily a recipe for success. It very well could be a recipe for failure.
Yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah. Well, I've shared even on this podcast that, I used to lead a really large group in my former life, but now managing a team is actually the hardest thing in the business for me. And it's very different when you're the owner, not just like the manager or the leader. It adds a totally different layer, at least for me, in leading when it's you, right? Like you're the owner and the manager. It really is an interesting dynamic.
It is. And, I think everybody is a leader, but you may not necessarily be a leader of people. You may be leading things or projects. You may be a leader in the family household, but you don't necessarily have to be a leader of people if you don't see fit. I always wanted to be a leader, and I've learned and worked on being a leader and working on training other people to be incredible leaders.
So is that really, because that's what you do now, right? Like, so shared that in the introduction that you're an executive business coach and you do keynotes and you help with leadership. Did that come from the lessons learned in the IT world? What was that transition like for you?
For sure. And, it really came from losing everything, getting it all back, building it up again, and just playing with everything that was in the way. But honestly, it came from a moment where I was able to just reflect on what I am about. I had a mentor and a coach at one point, and we tried to figure out, what does Likky love to do? And, the old cliches, bring success to others and all that kind of stuff. But it really came down to, I help people find their BS, because I had a lot of BS of my own that I had to find.
Yeah.
So now my title says Blind Spot Navigator or BS Navigator. You can take it however you want, but honestly, right, to be a good leader, you've got to find your blind spots and put them aside so you can lead a team the way they're supposed to be led.
So how do you identify your blind spots?
You work with other people. When we're driving, we check our blind spots on an ongoing basis because we don't want to get hit. Mm-hmm. But in life, we don't have a rear view mirror to check our own blind spots. Interesting enough, other people can see our blind spots right away. You really have to start working with your inner circle and build a trusted advisory group around you to say, hey, I'm opening this conversation up and saying, I'd love to get some feedback about things like, hey, what's the first impression of me when I show up into a room? I remember asking that question to my inner circle. The answer I received was, Likky, you actually show up as a pompous blank when you walk into a room. And I was shocked when I heard that, and then they go, no, sorry, hang on. No, you show up as a pompous blank until you start speaking. And when you start speaking, you're actually a lot of fun and you're caring and you're trusting. I go, so what shifted? And they go, well, when you walk in, you're all just dressed up and you just don't smile. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what that meant. And then what I realized was I smile with my teeth, but I don't smile with my face. So now when I walk into a room, I am full on smiles because I don't want to be known as a pompous blank. And that was a huge blind spot for me, because when I'd walk into a network environment, people wouldn't come and talk to me. I'd have to go reach out. And as soon as I started reaching out, it was fine. But now when I walk in, I am approachable. So people don't mind coming to talk to me.
So what do you think of 360 evaluations?
They're great.
Are you familiar with those? Do you do those?
For sure. They're great. I mean, that's a good way of finding out some of your own blind spots. So I look at blind spots as you have to ask feedback. You have to create a inner circle of people. You have to look back and see what your triggers and your patterns are. And what I mean by that is, imagine you're driving. What's your first reaction when somebody cuts you off? Do you get upset, or do you just think maybe they really have somewhere to go and I'm glad I moved out of the way to help them get there?
Yeah, I'm not that kind.
Yeah. So if you're the one that, flips the finger and gets really angry.
No, I don't do that.
But whatever you are, whatever trigger it is, look back and see what brought you to that trigger point. If you're the angry person or getting upset person, why are you impatient? What got you to that point? What's a blind spot that's getting you there?
Yeah, that's so interesting that you're even talking about impatience. So I remember doing some executive coaching way back when, and a huge blind spot for me was that because I am an impatient person, I often will jump straight into the work. And, as a manager, as a colleague, I would often, I wouldn't ask, how was your day? How are things going? It was like all work all the time. And that still is my, natural state, but did a lot of work around trying to show up and be present and be more relationship based and have those conversations, even if that's not my natural state or go-to, because it matters to others. And it's really difficult to lead people when they don't think that you care. I had no idea that, and that may sound silly, like as in that should just be obvious, but I didn't realize that I came across that way, because I actually am a very compassionate and caring person. But when I'm working, it's often, I just get straight to the point.
Sure. But that's who you are normally, and you can't see what impressions you're bringing out to others. And that's why they call it blind spots. And that's when it's incredible when you can create an environment of trust and vulnerability where you can actually share that. And people can give you some true feedback and talk to you about those things, because you want to know. I mean, most people want to know if they're impacting somebody negatively. The example I gave you about asking my inner circle about how do I show up. Now, would leaders actually even ask that question to people? Would a leader actually say, how do I show up to you? And if they do ask that question, will they do anything about it?
Mm-hmm.
And when you can shift to doing something about your blind spots, that's when you become that incredible human being and an incredible leader.
Mm-hmm. Is a blind spot different than confirmation bias?
Well, I've never used those words, confirmation bias.
Yeah.
I think I think they're very similar. You can call it whatever you want, but it's things that you can see about yourself.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of beliefs that you have about yourself. There's a lot of limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I just had that thought. I was just thinking of just bias, and I was thinking back to an old podcast episode where I shared, so Harvard, they have these tests that you can do on implicit bias. And it's set up in a way that like it really is supposed to pull it out, right? Like you can't try to beat the system. And as I suspected, and you and I have talked about this before, I have a very strong bias against white men. And so I'm aware of it, but I still feel like it's BS and it's a blind spot and it's something I have to focus on and work on all the time. And so that's where I was just wondering if like blind spots and bias can kind of go hand in hand, where you show up and assume things, not just about yourself, but about others based on old stories, and it impacting your ability to lead and connect.
For sure. And to me, I would say is, why do you have that bias? That's the blind spot. The blind spot isn't the bias. Getting to the root cause of why you have that bias or what caused that. What lifetime concern or event caused that bias to happen?
Yeah, there were a lot.
And so I'll share a small example for you. Honestly, if you had asked me to do a podcast with you 7 years ago, I probably would have said no. And that's because I had a lifelong stutter. I could not do this conversation, a stutter. Mm-hmm. And that stutter went away overnight when I found out what my blind spot was, what caused that stutter to happen. I'd gone to see doctors and psychologists and been on meds, but none of that helped. But the moment I realized what my blind spot was, the stutter goes away.
Wow.
So you've got to get back to, you can ask your questions about how do I show up, or what are the blind spots, but until you find out what the real reasons of the blind spot occurred, you won't really make that shift. Because those limiting beliefs only happen because of an event, but they only go away when you realize what the limiting belief, what that event caused you to believe in. Yeah.
So I know that you don't just do one-on-one coaching, but it feels right, like, because it can tap into old wounds, right? When you're doing this stuff, I'm assuming that was similar with your stutter, right?
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but in a corporate setting, because I'm imagining, because I know you do workshops and they're amazing. So how does that look? Because I'm thinking from like a trust and vulnerability perspective, when you're working with a group, right, where you're helping them with blind spots, do you guys dig into that stuff as a group, or is it a little bit lighter when everyone's together?
Well, no, definitely. We get called in organizations because of mainly functional blind spots, not emotional, right? Nobody wants to get emotional in an organization. That's not what they're about. But
right.
We don't have emotional blind spots. We have a bunch of functional blind spots. But what people don't realize, and I think they do, they're just afraid to say it. Yep. Those functional blind spots are caused by emotional blind spots.
Right.
Right. So when I go into an organization, I never talk about emotional blind spots right away. I start working on what the results are. What do you want to achieve? Now let's work backwards. What's stopping you from getting those results? And we'll find those functional blind spots. And it ends up being, we're not able to have proper conversations, and I can't call other people out. I can't hold others accountable, and there's no commitments. That comes back down to trust and vulnerability. Well, if you don't have trust and vulnerability, you really can't have those conversations to get the results you need. Well, why don't you have trust? And that's when the emotional side comes in. Everybody is feeling that we're doing as best as we can. We're doing what we need to do, but why are we still not getting those results that we need?
Yeah.
And when you start peeling back the layers, it really comes down to some emotional blind spots. The funniest part is when I walk into organizations, it's usually the owner, the CEO says, listen, my second in charge, my middle management needs some work. We need to get these results happening, and we're just not getting there. Can you come and help us do that? We're all results-based companies, which is great. I understand that. But within 10 minutes, I can tell the blind spot of the executive that's causing those results not to happen. Mm. And now we have to work through a conversation to bring that in and address that issue. Because if you don't address that issue, it's not going to work. Now, I will say I have walked out of organizations because they're not open to that conversation.
Right.
They don't want to go there, and that's okay. But when they do get there, the results that they get are incredible.
I'm thinking of the studies and the data that shows that when you have more women or just more diversity in general, right, on boards and companies, they tend to actually perform better from a results perspective. And if you actually talk to them about what's different, it's that they're more willing to actually have emotional conversations. And so I'm pondering here. I'm like, I wonder if that's a connection that you think it's that there's a willingness to have, because emotional blind spots, emotional conversations in general, it's that can lead to financial results. That can lead to retention of employees, even though there may be a feeling of if we talk about like these things don't matter, right? Like leave that at home. That shouldn't show up at work.
Definitely. And, vulnerability is, if we can get people to be vulnerable, and yeah, men have a hard time to be vulnerable. They really do. But if we can get entire organizations and teams to be vulnerable, that thing that we talk about, the culture thing?
Yeah.
People want to build culture. Well, become vulnerable and you'll build the culture around it. Mm. You don't actually go into an organization for the work that they do. You don't go into the organization for the boss anymore. You actually go into organizations for the culture that's created. And culture attracts, fires, as well as detracts employees. And if you want an organization to be incredible, just start by doing something as simple as being vulnerable to your team members and then being able to have real conversations. That conversation that you really want to have, but you only have half of it because you're afraid to say the other half?
Yeah.
Yeah. You should be able to say that conversation 100%, and then you can get on with it. So I say conflict could be good or bad. Blind spots can be good or bad as well. Mm. You just have to see what they are.
Tell me how a blind spot can be good.
Well, if you think about, if you're a connector and you love to connect with people, but you just don't know what's making you do that, it could be the way you were brought up, loving, caring. And now you're taking that love and care into your entire organization. Now, that's a good blind spot to realize why you're like that.
Oh, I see.
Right? People don't think of it that way. People just think I'm a great networker, I'm a connector. But there's a reason why you're that way. And then the total opposite could happen as well. Not many people will work towards finding out why they're so good. They'll find out why they're not so good. Mm-hmm. And that's when the bad blind spots come into play.
Right.
I want to take that back. There's never a bad blind spot. If you want to know your blind spots, they're all good. Mm. Because it'll help you to be the vulnerable person that you want to be and become the leader and the human being that you want to become by putting that BS out of the way.
Yeah, I would suspect that if you have someone who is not interested in learning about or addressing or leveraging their blind spots, it's probably a pretty narcissistic person, right? You're probably going to struggle with helping that team in general.
Oh, for sure. And there's a lot of people that we know and that don't care. They're just there to achieve the financial results. And that's okay. That's their path. And they've chosen that path. And there's nothing wrong with that. But one thing I do know is that the team below that person is very similar, or they're just not happy working there. Mm-hmm. Because that's the only kind of people you'll attract and keep. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're a financial-based company, and that's all you care about, not a problem. Just hire people like that. Just won't be a fun place to work.
Right. So I'm thinking we have a lot of listeners, some of whom are they're business owners or they are managing teams. And then we have a lot who are, so they might be thinking, what are my blind spots? And then we probably have some people on here who are thinking of their bosses or supervisors or managers or the people who own companies. And they're like, oh my gosh, that person has blind spots. So for both, I mean, I think we all need to be working on them, but I'm curious if it's something that you want to address in your organization and you're not the owner, right? You're an employee. Is there a way for them to approach that in a way where it might be receptive?
Well, Gandhi actually has an incredible saying: you must be the change you wish to see in others. Mm-hmm. So if you think there are blind spots around, just be the change. Be the person to shift your own blind spots and then share that experience with others. Now, I don't go into any organization asking them to find their blind spots. I go into an organization sharing my blind spots. I go into organizations sharing what top blind spots I find in other organizations, and then they find if they're open to it. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever wants to be forced to look for their blind spots unless they're open to that. But the only way that happens is because by me being vulnerable and sharing mine.
Right.
But if there's a middle management that says, we do have a concern here, there are some ways that we're not able to communicate with our superiors or even to their leading teams, then you can have simple conversations by building trust. And, I always say, if you bring your small group together and get to know them as human beings and build that trust, things like get to know your teammate and ask them something that you don't know about them. Tell them to share something that they haven't shared with anybody yet about yourself. Get to know them at an intrinsic level as opposed to the fluff level. Mm-hmm. And once you build that trust, then you can start talking about feedback. So there's some sample feedback questions I use, right? I'm going to ask you, how do I control my emotions in front of you? And what bothers you about me? Now, these are really simple questions, but you have to be open to asking these things. Do I come across as a helper or self-centric? Do I inspire or demotivate others? Once you start asking these types of questions, once you build that trust, you can start getting some true feedback right away.
Yeah, I suspect that can be difficult to hear. It's easy for me to say, but I don't do one-on-one coaching at the time. So I'm not completely selling here, but I really think you need to be working with a coach to be doing this.
A facilitated session. So when we go into an organization, we have a 4-hour session where we break them down. Like literally, I did a session for a company just a couple of months before this thing happened, where the second in charge, it's a large telco company, second in charge came in an hour after the meeting started because he had another meeting. But there was 13 executives in that meeting. The 13 of them were having fun. They were just loose and just getting stuff done. As soon as the second in charge walked in, the mood shifted. Became very professional, right down to business. And I can see that, respect and, just get down to business. But I noticed that. I noticed the body languages of people shifting. So I went straight into vulnerability mode about sharing some of my vulnerable concerns that I had when I was growing up and some of the things that I came across when I was running my businesses and sharing some other vulnerability of other companies. And an hour into this conversation, the second in charge looks at me and he goes, Likky, I've had years of therapy. Now, by him even saying that showed vulnerability.
Yep.
You can just see the other 13 executives, just body language shifted, wanting to hear more of it. He goes, Likky, I've had years of therapy, but in this last hour, you've broken me down. Let's get on with this. This is a lot of fun. As soon as he did that, everybody else became vulnerable as well.
Yeah.
It just takes that one person to realize what's happening in the room.
Right. So powerful. And I just think in corporate America in general, right? I mean, we are taught from such a young age that we are supposed to show up in a very specific way. And we tend to have walls. I mean, that's why, with all of my masterminds and the other stuff I do, we start with this type of work of what you're talking about, of learning about each other and having conversations that normally would not be acceptable. But I think those are the conversations we need to be having everywhere. It's what keeps us from thriving in our careers, because we're having to show up as people we're not, and we're constantly holding back. And I think it just makes us show up in a really dysfunctional and sad way.
It does. And I mean, I don't want to be going anywhere in a battle with somebody I don't know and trust. So if you're in an organization, that trust and vulnerability is probably the key perspective to build an organization. You know, Howard Schultz, from the CEO of Starbucks, has an incredible saying, and I'm just going to share it with you. Because I think the currency of leadership is transparency. You've got to be truthful. I don't think you should be vulnerable every day, but there are moments where you've got to share your soul and conscience with people and show them who you are and not be afraid of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you can be that captain going up that storm and fighting that perfect storm, but you also have to be vulnerable to say, I'm worried about this storm that's coming up here. And as soon as you say, I'm worried, you'll bring the team together.
Mm-hmm.
It's all you have to say. It's all you have to do is just be a little bit more vulnerable and work through things. When you do that, the team just melts together. And that will allow conversations to happen about blind spots and what else is in the way. And once you get all that BS out of the way, imagine the organization, what's going to happen to it.
Right.
And I've seen organizations pivot overnight when the blind spots are resolved and found.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, like, when you think of leaders within companies, the ones that you tend to be attracted to the most and you want to do what they're suggesting, you think they're real. They're not hiding things from you, that they're not fake. I think sometimes as leaders, you feel as though you got to have it together all of the time. You have to have all of the answers. And that's part of where the wall comes from. But it also makes people not trust you and wonder what you're hiding.
Well, what that says to me is that they're just not congruent in their messaging. They're pretending to be one and not really being congruent in the delivery of what their values are.
Mm-hmm.
And, the other thing, if you think about in organizations, what really ends up happening is that back talking of others. And if a leader does that gossip thing, that happens, well, that just drops the trust with everybody. And if somebody is gossiping and talking about others, why are they doing that? What's the limiting belief that they're trying to hide? Is it to make themselves feel better because they've got a limiting belief of I'm not good enough, or there's the imposter syndrome kicking in?
Mm-hmm.
And once we resolve those things, that gossiping and that congruency of your messaging comes a lot more clearer than anything else does. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, most of my experience is in the legal world, and there is a lot of insecurity there. Lots of fragile egos and insecurity and perfectionism. And so I do think it sometimes can create a not a pretty picture, but I think that there's so much opportunity to be a great leader by being willing to look at not just those functional blind spots, but those emotional blind spots. Yeah, this has been so good. Okay, so quick question. For those listening, if they want to learn more about blind spots or have you coming into their companies, how can they best find you? How can they reach out to you?
Well, the easiest is on LinkedIn. Just find Likky Lavji. There are not too many Lickys around. So it's Likky. Not many of those around. Now imagine growing up with a name like Likky. Imagine the blind spots I had to deal with and the bullying I had to deal with.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, but yeah, it's Likky Lavji or LikkyLavji.com. Either way. And stay tuned for a book that's going to be released in the next month.
Oh, wow.
Around this.
Do you have a title that you can share with us?
We're working through that. And
Okay.
Yeah, it's working through that. But look up Blind Spots or Trust the Compass.
Nice. All right. So, but if people follow you on LinkedIn, reach out, do a connection, I'm sure they will then see an announcement when it's ready.
That's right.
Awesome. Likky, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed having this conversation. You've given me so much food for thought, and I'm going to dig into my blind spots. I'm going to dig into my BS a little bit more.
Well, Heather, it's always a pleasure talking to you, but I really appreciate the opportunity to get on your podcast. You do an incredible job with them.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone, have a great week. For show notes, downloads, and other free resources, and to keep the conversation going, head on over to hustleandflowpodcast.com. See you there.